Hey there guys, I am the Six Machine and welcome back to another Warhammer video. Things have been a tad light on the 40k news this week, so I just wanted to put out a very quick video about my thoughts on what we may see for the upcoming Sisters of Battle tank, the Castigator. Obviously we don't know anything concrete yet, but I thought it might be fun to just spitball a couple of ideas, maybe have a guesstimate on the points cost of it, and see who gets the closest and most accurate to things like the weapon stat lines when we finally get to see some proper rules. So, let's get started. Now, obviously, the Castigator is based on the Rhino chassis, and as I'm sure you can all tell, is very similar in design to the Space Marine's Predator. The main differences, aside from all the bling, being the hull-mounted heavy bolter and also the much larger, more robust main turret on top, which also comes with some very different weapon options compared to the old Predator. But before we get onto the weapons, I wanted to talk about the stat line of the vehicle itself. You can see on the screen now the Predator stat line, and you may think that this will be exactly the same. It is, after all, pretty much a Sisters of Battle Predator. But if you look more closely, that front hull area has definitely got some additional layers of protection and armor, and in fact we do see that same kind of reinforced hull almost identically on the Sisters of Battle Exorcist. So whilst I do think that the stat line will remain the same in terms of being movement 12, ballistic skill 3+, and having a 3-up save, I do think that we will see some marked differences in that I believe the toughness and wounds characteristics of this tank will be much more in line with what we see on the Exorcist, and that is to say toughness 8 instead of toughness 7, and having 12 wounds instead of 11. Now, these are not insignificant changes. As I went over in my Vindicator video, having that toughness 8 is a very big deal when it comes to not only surviving firepower from things like missile launchers and autocannons, but getting through those hails of light arms fire which tend to be at strength 4. So right off the bat, I do think that in terms of pure survivability, this is going to be a step above the Space Marine Predator. Another thing that I think is almost guaranteed, and again because the Exorcist has the same, is that it will have the Shield of Faith rule, which grants it a 6-up invulnerable save. Now, whilst this isn't the most useful save to have, as you will still have your 6-up armor anyway against anything AP3 or below, it does mean that against things like Melter, which is having a huge resurgence at the moment, as well as things like Space Marine las cannons in turn 1, you do still have that, albeit small, chance of shrugging off a hit, whilst the Space Marine's Predator will have no defenses whatsoever. So if we're going to consider the base cost of this tank, as in just the chassis itself with no weapons, I do think that it will be a fair bit higher than the Predator. With the Annihilator pattern of the Predator costing 130 points with the twin las cannons, which we can pretty much put at a cost of 40 odd points due to the fact that the Spons and las cannons are 20 points each, means that the Predator roughly has a chassis cost of 90 points. And I think that the Castigator will be much more in line with something like a Lehman Russ, which, although the Astra Militarum haven't had their 9th edition codex, so this may be subject to change, sits at around the 140 points mark for the base chassis. Now, I don't think the Castigator will be quite that much, as I do think that the grinding advance rule for the Lehman Russ does add quite a decent chunk to its points, but I wouldn't be surprised if we were looking at around 120 odd points just for the base chassis of the Castigator tank. Now, obviously in 9th edition, base weapon loadouts tend to be baked into the cost, so the base cost of the tank itself will be higher, as it will include the battle cannon and presumably the hull heavy bolter, which I'm guessing will be mandatory. But still, it's nice to get a rough idea for just how much the hull of the tank itself costs, I think. When it comes to the weapons itself, obviously first and foremost we have the 3 heavy bolters. As mentioned, I'm almost certain the hull-mounted heavy bolter will be mandatory, as they quite often tend to be, but whether the sponsored ones are, or indeed if there are any other options for them to take, we just aren't sure. They did state in the preview that they couldn't take heavy flamers, but that doesn't specifically mean that they can't take, for instance, multi-melters, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to consider heavy bolters as the only option they have. So straight off the bat, not only is that 9 really potent anti-marine shots coming from this thing, and indeed, Most anti-infantry, whether you're shooting this at a horde of boys or even a squad of 3 outrider bikes, you are going to be doing a fair amount of damage. Statistically, you should kill 1 outrider bike if you shoot at it with the 3 heavy bolters, so no matter what you're shooting at, you are going to be doing a good amount of work. This does, however, immediately add 45 points to the tank straight off the bat, putting the chassis and the heavy bolters alone at a price tag of 165 points, which already puts you in the ballpark of either Predator option with heavy bolter sponsons and their main turret weapon. So as you can imagine, depending on the price of the main gun of the Castigator, this could end up being a pretty pricey thing to bring to the tabletop. When it comes to the main weapons, I want to cover the autocannon variant first because there are a few things to think about here. The first of which is that the autocannon itself does look vaguely similar to the Predator autocannon from the Marine version, but if I'm being honest, I don't know if it will be exactly the same. We know that it's called the Castigator autocannon, and I just think that if it is exactly the same as 2 of the Space Marine Predator versions, you're looking at 4d3 strength 7 minus 1 AP 3 damage shots, which funnily enough is exactly what the Armiger Helverins are loaded with. So whilst this isn't out of the realms of possibility, this does exist on the tabletop currently, it does seem a bit much if you also factor in the heavy bolters. That could be 21 shots each doing 2 or 3 damage, and I just think if that is the profile, this tank is going to be incredibly expensive. If we do a tiny bit more napkin math, you can consider that the Predator is 90 points base. The autocannon variant pushes it up to 140 points, meaning that a single one of the Predator autocannons is priced at around 50 points. So if the Castigator twin autocannon is the same profile as 2 Predator autocannons, you'd be looking at 120 points base based on my estimates for the chassis cost, plus 45 for the heavy bolters, plus 100 for the autocannons, which is, hitting 265 points right there. And I mean, at that point, I just don't think anyone would bring it because it's just going to be shot off the board turn 1. That amount of firepower and that much of a chunk of your army, any enemy is just going to look at it and be like, toughness 8, 12 wounds, 3 up save, 6 up invulnerable. It's not bad, but I can easily take 1 or 2 of them out in a turn. And you're just down, over 500 points if you've bought 2 of them and they just get taken out turn 1. But equally, I don't think they're just going to be regular autocannons. With a normal twin autocannon, you'd be looking at 4 shots, strength 7, minus 1 AP, 2 damage, and that just doesn't feel anywhere near enough, in my opinion. I mean, the gun definitely looks a lot meaner and nastier and meatier than 4 strength 7 2 damage shots, you know what I mean? So is there a happy medium? Well, actually, it turns out there is. What about something like the suppressor autocannons? Now, as we all know, these are heavy 3, minus 1 AP and 2 damage, which would mean the Castigator autocannon turret with the twin version would be heavy 6, minus 1 AP, 2 damage, which is funnily enough exactly the same as the Firestrike servo turret. And I think that would actually be a reasonable profile for this gun. It's not quite as devastating in terms of damage output as the Helverin autocannon or the Predator autocannon, but it makes up for it with weight of fire in that you have those guaranteed 6 shots rather than rolling 2d3 for the Predator version. The only other thing that I might consider is that they may have looked at all 3, the Predator autocannon, the regular autocannon, and the suppressor version, and come up with a mix of the 3, and maybe instead of going with heavy 3, minus 1 AP, 2 damage per autocannon, they might switch it round and do something like heavy 2, minus 1 AP, and 3 damage, so the Castigator turret itself would be heavy 4, minus 1 AP, and a flat 3 damage. And the reason I think this is because it kind of brings it in line with the Predator autocannon turret, balancing out the swingy 2d3 shots for a much more reliable 2 shots per gun, and then keeps the same AP and the same flat 3 damage, which the heavier vehicle-mounted autocannons seem to have, with the Predator and the Armigers having 3 damage, whilst the lesser handheld or marine held autocannon variants have 2 damage. So I'm not sure how they're going to play it, but I think overall I'm swinging towards the fact that the Castigator twin autocannon may well be heavy 4, -1 AP, and a flat 3 damage to give it that similar profile to the Space Marine Predator, but giving it a bit more reliability and a bit more, a bit less dice rolling, if nothing else. You know, instead of 2d3 shots, they're just giving you a flat 4. I think that would be easier. I think it would be just as potent, be less swingy, be more reliable, and still kick out a good chunk of damage. But now onto the big boy himself, the Castigator Battle Cannon. It strikes me as being somewhat less blasty than a regular battle cannon, but not quite as single shot as the Vanquisher battle cannon. That's how I see it in my head. I think if I was going to use real life terms, if the regular battle cannon was high explosive and the Vanquisher cannon was armor penetrating, I would put this as a happy medium between the two. And I do think that likewise, that's how it's going to be reflected in the rules. So as it stands currently, the battle cannon has strength 8, 2 AP, D3 damage with D6 shots and the blast rule, and the Vanquisher cannon is heavy 1, strength 8, -3 AP, D6 damage, and when you roll damage with it, you roll 2 dice and discard the lowest. So is the Castigator battle cannon going to be somewhere between those? Well, I know I just said that, but possibly not. Because you've got to remember the Astra Militarum haven't had their 9th edition codex yet, and I do genuinely think that if any weapon is going to be getting a big glow up, it's going to be the Vanquisher battle cannon. So I do think that the Castigator battle cannon may end up being on paper much better than the current Vanquisher cannon, but perhaps not as good as the new Vanquisher cannon will be when the Astra Militarum get their 9th edition book. Does that make sense? So while you may look at what I'm going to throw out there for the Castigator battle cannon and say that's much better than the Vanquisher, you do have to consider that I don't think the Vanquisher cannon is going to stay as it is currently. So with that in mind, I can see the Castigator battle cannon getting something along the lines of heavy 2, strength 8, -3 AP, and 3 plus D3 damage. So it's much better at taking out really heavily armored vehicles and tanks compared to the autocannon variant, but it's half the number of shots, which puts the other version of the Castigator very much in line as an anti-infantry and anti-light armor vehicle. Now you may have also noticed that this puts both weapon variants in slightly similar but different positions compared to the Space Marine versions. The autocannon on the Castigator has the same AP and damage, but sacrifices the potential for 6 shots to maintain a steady 4 constantly. Likewise, the Castigator battle cannon sacrifices that extra pip of strength compared to the twin las cannons, but instead gains that much better, in my opinion, reliability in having a flat 3 plus D3 damage profile when it does wound. Obviously, the Space Marine Predator has an advantage if you want to go for a purely tank hunter build, as you can take the 2 spons and las cannons, which is why, in my opinion, if my predictions all come to pass, the autocannon variant of the Castigator may be the way to go. Because if you can't swap out those heavy bolter sponsons, you may as well just go all in and make your tank the absolute bane of Marines and other 2-wound infantry everywhere, with at least 9 damage 2 shots, and depending on how the autocannon pans out, potentially another 4 or 6, or if you're really highballing it with the twin Predator autocannon profile, an extra 12 shots potentially that could be either damage 2 or 3. It's just going to absolutely mow down anything from hordes to potentially even Terminator squads with just sheer volume of fire. Now this will all come at a price, of course, and I do genuinely believe that with the extra survivability from what I think will be a toughness 8 12 wound chassis with a 6-up invulnerable save, the extra hull heavy bolter, and either of the turret weapon options, you are going to be looking at a points cost of over 200 points for this thing. And will that be worth it? Well, I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. So that's just a few of my thoughts on the Castigator, but I would love to know what you think the stat line of this thing will be, and also what you think the profile for the battle cannon and the autocannon turrets may bring along. I would love to hear your thoughts on this tank overall, if you think it's going to be worth it, and whether you're going to be getting one to add to your sisters. I'd also be quite interested to know if you think it's going to take a spot away from the Exorcist, or do you still think the Exorcist will be the go-to choice for, I suppose, anti-armor for the sisters, because it's got those strength 8 missiles? Do you think that the Castigator will take away any of the Exorcist spots, or do you think the Exorcist is just going to be much better for the role that it fulfills? Thank you again for all your support and comments. I really, really do appreciate it, and please do leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more Warhammer content from me. Until next time, though, I will catch you later, guys.